Pigeons were first domesticated in Egypt over 5,000 years ago, but it wasn't until 1818 that the first organized racing system with pigeons took place in Belgium for a 100-mile course. Pigeons have an incredible ability to find their way back to the loft that they were hatched in, being able to travel over thousands of miles. The racing pigeons would be transported for hundreds of miles away from their loft and then released, and they'd be timed for how quickly they could fly back, averaging 40 miles per hour, but some over 90 miles per hour. A lot of money was bet on pigeon racing, and pretty soon the clock became very important in the process. This is a first-generation Pigeon Racing Clock. It records the time the pigeon returned to the loft on a paper disc, which is nestled inside a tamper-proof case. Before the race, a numbered ring or band would be placed around one of the legs of the pigeon before it was released, after which it would fly back to its loft. The owner or the fancier of the pigeon would remove the ring and insert it in the top of the clock, and then advance the mechanism to record the time that the pigeon arrived. By knowing the distance traveled and the time that it took, an average speed could be calculated to determine the winner. But let's take a look inside the clock to figure out exactly how that recording mechanism works. We'll remove the glass cover as well as the paper disc to see how it's made inside. I'll begin by winding the mainspring of the movement. Despite being 150 years old, the movement starts up right away on its own. It's an amazing thing. And we can see the paper disc turn, driven by the movement. Let's take a closer look at the disc itself. We can trace back the printer of this particular disc, and we know that it came from Belgium, Strut. But the important aspect of this paper disc is the hole pattern which is punched into it, which you can see on the front and more clearly on the back of the disc. When the pigeon gets back to the loft, the band is dropped in the top of the clock, and the side is activated to advance a carousel inside the clock. At the same time, a metal poker pierces the paper disc, logging the time at which the ring was received into the clock. You can read the time that the birds arrive based upon the holes and the markings on the disc. The larger holes are made by a separate poker, which identifies when the case was open and closed for security purposes. So that's the Pigeon Racing Clock, first generation, that was used commonly throughout Europe in the mid-1800s. Taking advantage of the pigeon's ability to fly home, Baghdad created the first pigeon post system in 1150. In World War I, the British Army used pigeons extensively, even protecting them from gas attacks. Likewise, the Royal Air Force also used messenger pigeons, writing messages, attaching them to the legs of the pigeon, and releasing them to fly back home and deliver the message. The British Navy also used messenger pigeons to send messages back from ships as well as submarines in a fast and reliable fashion. Reuters news agency began as a pigeon service, providing stock prices between Belgium and Germany. But it was the continued growth of pigeon racing which drove the development of the second generation of pigeon racing clocks. The big advantage of the second generation clocks was that it recorded the arrival times on a paper tape that was printed instead of having to read holes punched into a disc. This clock has a chain of thimbles that was used to catch the race rings when they were inserted into the top. As with the first generation of pigeon clocks, the racing ring would be returned in the top, and the advance of the machinery would take place to print the arrival time on the paper tape. Let's take a closer look inside this later model of the second generation style. Before the race ring would be attached to the pigeon's leg, and back at the loft, the ring would be taken off and put in the top of the clock. Finally, the advance mechanism would be turned to both lock in the race ring as well as to advance and print the time that the arrival took place on the paper tape. We'll begin by taking a look inside by releasing the tamper-proof latch. Next, I'll remove the carousel off the top, and you can see the inserted race ring towards the top of the carousel, right underneath my index finger. Now we can have a better view about what happens when you advance the mechanism and print. As you wind the key, a plate is pulled back and then releases, forcing the paper tape against an ink pad. I'll remove the clock mechanism from the housing. And on the clock dial, in addition to the time, I can see where to wind it, which thimble will be used next, and how many seconds in addition to the time has been accrued. Plus, on the back, I have a mirror image of the time as well as the thimble number and the seconds that's going to be printed on the paper tape once the activation is completed. Pigeon races ranged between 60 and 600 miles, and oftentimes large groups of pigeons were released at one time using trains. There were several different makers for pigeon racing clocks in Europe and in the United States, this one featuring a beautiful chrome mechanism. Pigeon racing clocks are 100% mechanical. There's no electricity or batteries, yet they really stood up over the 100 to 150 years that they've been around, and they were prized possessions for the pigeon racing community that owned them. And as the pigeon racing clocks evolved, accuracy and security became paramount. There was a lot of money at stake in the pigeon racing world. And the longest flight for a pigeon ever recorded was with the U.S. Army for 2,300 miles. The first pigeon racing held in the United States was in 1875, and it was a big sport in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Although pigeon racing has declined in popularity, there still are 15,000 lofts in the United States today. There was a proud legacy of pigeon racing, and fortunately we still have the clocks to remind us of the days gone by.